Okay, today's notes we're going to be looking at evolution. We're going to look at a couple different things throughout the notes. We're going to look at early Earth, what is evolution, Charles Darwin, and then evidence for evolution. So let's first start off with early Earth. Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, and then life originated on Earth about 3.5 to 4 million years ago. In the image, we've got a clock showing, so if you could break a life of Earth down into an hour, this would be the initial formation of Earth, and then you'd see development of, or like all of the development of living things. So the first mammal, if all of the history of Earth was 1 hour, the first mammal wouldn't have appeared until 57 minutes after Earth had began. So mammals have only been on Earth for about 3 minutes of that span. The first human ancestor is just a few seconds. Humans have been on Earth over the whole history. So it's pretty interesting to see in something relatable like this, like the passing of 1 hour. So early Earth didn't have oxygen in the air. RNA would have been the first genetic material. RNA would have formed, and then simple cells would have formed. They would have been prokaryotes, like similar to like bacteria now. Eukaryotes would have formed after that. Eukaryotes are like animal or plant cells, and they would have formed by endosymbiosis. And that again is when a large prokaryotic cell engulfs a smaller one, and the small prokaryotes become like organelles. They could develop things like mitochondria and chloroplasts. Those first simple celled organisms are going to slowly release oxygen, and that oxygen is going to help to produce an atmosphere on Earth. In the image, this is a picture of a hot spring in Yellowstone. So just in the hot spring area, you could imagine that's similar conditions to early Earth, and the bacteria in the hot springs can give off things like oxygen that would help to form early atmosphere. So what is evolution? Evolution is just change over time. In the image here, I've given you pictures of Hawaiian honeycreepers, and these are all the same species, but you can see the different beaks that have developed as the organisms have lived, the birds have lived on different islands, and they've got different food sources, and so their beaks are completely different. But it took lots of time for the birds to change. So the theories of evolution were pulled together. There was multiple theories that were in existence, but they were all pulled together by Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809, died in 1882, and from 31 to 36 is when he sails on the HMS Beagle, and that boat takes him around the world, and he journals everything that he sees, and that's where he starts to pull together his theory of evolution. So the picture here, you can see this is his trip. You can see all of his travels. He went down to South America, back up to the Galapagos, then around to Australia, south below Africa, and then back to England. So he observes, collects evidence, and the evidence was the big thing. There were theories about evolution at the time, but he gets like physical evidence that he can use to prove evolution. And that main spot is the Galapagos Island. And when he was at the Galapagos Island, he looks at the different beaks of finch that are on the island. So here's examples of what the Galapagos finch look like. And they have different food sources from the different islands. And so one initial finch species developed into all the varieties that you see in the image. Um, and so two key ideas are that species change over time and that natural selection causes changes in the characteristics of species. Um, and those changes can eventually develop into the creation of a completely new species. Some more of Darwin's discoveries is the idea of descent with modification. And here's an actual sketch from his journal. And the idea is showing, if we can imagine the finch example, here's the oldest ancestor of the finch. And at some point in time, there's some change in its environment, and it branches off into three of the varieties. And then as time passes, those three varieties continue to branch out, forming new varieties in the organism. And that kind of also goes along with the organisms being united to a single tree of life. If we were to look at all living things, we'd have a bacteria somewhere at the bottom of our little branching tree. And as time passes, that bacteria branches out, becomes a eukaryotic cell, maybe a protist. That protist changes over time and can develop into plant, animal, or fungus. And then here's another example of the descent with modification. So some of the different skull and fossil evidence that we found for camel. So this is what a camel looks like in our current time, and this is the skeleton from that camel. And then we found fossil evidence for, if we go back in time, for different variations of that same species. And if you were to go way back, the earliest skeleton that we found looks something like this. So as an organism changes over time, it can look and eventually look completely different than its original ancestor. In 1859, Darwin published the book On the Origin of Species. And that's where he put together all of his ideas on evolution. I'll move that down for you. Darwin proposed the mechanism for evolution, and that was natural selection. So, setting the stage for evolution, you have this, like, organisms are going to be reproducing. They're going to reproduce more offspring than can survive. There's going to be restrictions in the environment. So, limited resources for organisms to use to survive. And that's going to create a struggle for existence. Organisms are going to compete for food, for space, and those organisms are going to have certain variations that are going to make them more or less successful. If they're successful, they're going to pass those variations on. And that means, here I put it as the persistence of adaptive traits. So the traits that help the organism survive are going to get passed on. And those organisms in their environment's going to change, and that's going to have, that's going to mean those different variations are going to be pushed to be more or less effective as the environment changes. And that's going to cause evolution. So you want to go ahead and draw this, you can draw this graph in with notes on what's happening and how natural selection is occurring. The next part that we're going to move to is the evidence for evolution. So I put two pictures up. One of the major ways that things that we use to prove evolution is fossil evidence. So I've included two examples. I've got fossil evidence for human evolution, going from primitive early humans to like what a modern skull would look like. And then I've also gotten fossil evidence for whales. So here's the most primitive example of a whale skeleton. And as we move forward in time, this is a modern whale skeleton. Cool thing about the whale, it's got this hip bone right here. So even though whales don't have back legs, they still have the remnants of a hip bone. So if you were to find like um, a blue whale or a modern whale, um, and you were able to look at its skeleton, you'd see this primitive hip bone that still exists. Another piece of evidence for evolution is called biogeography, and that's studying the distribution of species around the planet and the factors that influence that distribution. And I've tried to represent it with a little graphic here. So if we had an island, we have the species A on the island, and then at some point that island splits and starts to drift apart. Then we have species A on this part, and then we have new species developing. So species A is split now into species A and B. And then our island splits again, and the same process happens. We have species A, B, and C, and it happens again, and eventually we have all 5 of these different species. If we look here at this representation, we have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor developed into organism A, and eventually split off into all these different varieties of the same species. So it might have a different appearance, but it's all linked to the same species. And then not only do we look at this, it being the same organism, but we look at how that organism got distributed around the land in that area. Or it could be the ocean if it was a fish or water organism. Okay, next piece of evidence for evolution is comparative anatomy, and that's studying the similarities and differences in the anatomy of different organisms. So even though we have a human and a bat, even though they're both mammals, they're both mammals, and even though their arm looks completely different, if you looked at the bone structure of both a human and a bat, you see some really strong similarities. So first of all, you've got this humerus bone. Both humans and bats have it. And then in the forearm part of a human and a bat, you have 2 bones, the same 2 bones. And then if you could look into a bat, the bat wing, it actually has a hand that spreads out in the wing, just like a human hand. It has the carpals, metacarpals, and even phalanges. So even though bats, whales, and cats and humans, all 4 structures look completely different, the underlying structure of the bone structure is really similar, showing that even though the organisms look completely different on the outside, they could develop over time from similar structures. Okay, and then there's 2 more pieces. One more piece of evidence is comparative embryology, and that's looking at like if you looked at the early developing embryo in vertebrates. So we have a fish, we've got an amphibian, we've got the salamander, and we've got a human. If you look at all the developing embryo, they look very similar at that in the first initial part of development. As time goes by, then it starts to look a bit different, but in the early stages, it's very similar in embryo development. Humans, so even as an embryo, we have gill slits, and we have a tail in early embryonic development, and those things disappear over time, which is pretty interesting. And then our last piece of evidence for evolution is molecular homology. And what that means is just looking at molecules and the similarity between molecules between different organisms. So in our graph here, or in our image here, we're looking at red blood cells. And if you compared, you looked at the number of amino acids that are different. So the protein that makes up a red blood cell, and you compared how similar they are between a human, a monkey, a mouse, chicken, frog, and lamprey. as we move this way, um, there's only a few amino acids different between the human and the monkey. Um, to the mouse, it gets a little bit more different. Chicken, even more different. Frog, you can see how it progresses. Um, you could also look at overall DNA similarities, so you can compare a human and, say, a bonobo monkey. We have like 98% similar DNA and genes. Um, so that's another way to compare um, organisms. Um, this type of evidence wasn't available to Darwin, so this is something that he could use to discuss natural selection, but something that we can use now.